This is an all-purpose Genoise cake batter. Use it for layer cakes, wedding cakes, little cakes, petits, for special cakes like Madeleines, sponge sheets for jelly rolls. It's Madeleine and the Genoise jelly roll, today on the French Chef.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. I've got to have some beurre noisette, meaning some browned butter, for my cake batter. And I want to have 1 stick plus 2 tablespoons, or 5 ounces, 1 1/4 sticks of butter. And that is to melt. And then it's to turn brown, a light brown, and it foams up. And when it's done, it's going to look like this. See, that's a nice light brown color. And it's very simple to make. The just thing is that you keep your eye on it and don't get too far away from it. It takes about 5 or 6 minutes over moderately high heat to cook. And so while that's cooking, I can get to the beginning part of my batter. And this is going to be an all-purpose batter. And it has such familiar ingredients as eggs and flour and butter. And what the cake is called depends on how you mix your eggs, flour, butter, and sugar together. And there are 2 main French cake families, and the one that's most familiar is the sponge cake batter, which is made with separated eggs, meaning that you have the egg yolks in the batter and then you whip the whites and fold them in. But the cake batter we're using today is called the Genoise, which means that you use whole eggs. You don't separate them at all, and you beat them with eggs and sugar until they're thick and foamy like this. And to achieve that, we have 4 eggs, and these eggs should be warm. And whether or not you take them out of the refrigerator, put them in warm water for about 10 minutes, and you'll see why later. And also you want a very clean bowl, meaning that it hasn't got any fat in it. Because if it has any fat in it, you're not going to be able to get the eggs to mount up. And we want 2/3 cup of sugar. 2/3 cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. Don't use any kind of fake vanilla or vanilla flavoring. If you're going to use vanilla, use the pure extract, because the other just has a cheap, bad taste and doesn't have any place in good French cooking. And then we also want the grated rind of 1 lemon. And I find that the best graters are made out of stainless steel, and for grating lemon, there's some little round holes with little caps on them that just get hold of the lemon and send it through to the other side. You could use grated orange peel in this, and some people use fancy flavorings like bergamot. And then this is going to go into the electric mixer and just set it on high. And it's got to beat, and it's going to take 6 or 8 minutes to reach this beautiful foamy stage. And I think in the old days, before electric mixers, you had to beat the whole thing like by hand. It would take you an awfully long time to do it that way. Just beat, 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 beat. And I think that's one reason that the Genoise was probably done by more professional things. Or you could beat it. You can use a handheld electric beater if you don't have the table model. The nice thing about the table model, I'm keeping my eye on my butter over there. The table model is that you can go off and do something else while you're beating. And I'm not going to I'm not going to beat the whole 6 or 8 minutes here, but this is because there isn't anything interesting. It just beats and beats until it reaches this nice pale stage. You notice the difference in it. And you can beat them a little bit ahead of time and then just put the mixer on low to keep the eggs up. But you want to be sure and not overbeat. Say that you have an important telephone call and you go off and talk for half an hour. You come back and you're going to find that you've overbeaten and the eggs have become dry. So if you have to go off for any time and you can't be in the kitchen, just stop the beater and then you can go on again afterwards. And now we're going to take a look at the butter. God, I left it too long. This has become absolutely black. That's a good illustration of what happens to brown butter when you don't look at it. This is the way it's supposed to be, and I even have another one that's the way it's supposed to be, and the black one, unfortunately, has now gone beyond the pale, and we can't use it for anything. But that's a very good illustration. It's lucky that I had some backup butter. And this butter is to be cool. In other words, after you've done it, you let it cool, or else you stir it around in cold water before you use it. And now I'm going to take, we had 2 tablespoons extra butter here. I just want 1 stick of butter. And I'm going to take 2 tablespoons out. And these are going to be used to butter me pans with. And then I'll save the rest of that for the cake batter. The first thing we're going to make with this is Madeleines. And these are the Madeleines in the pans that they bake in. See, they bake like this and then they have a little ridged underside, like a little shell shape. And you can get this pan here happens to be an aluminum one that was made in Hong Kong and is available a great deal in this country. And this is a French pan, which is of rather heavy tinned metal. So you can use either pan and they both work equally well. I was surprised that the aluminum one worked very well indeed. If you don't have Madeleine pans, you can use scallop shells. So you see there's a scallop shell and there are the little ridges. And it may be quite possible that before, in the early days, they used to bake them in scallop shells. Nobody seems to know the origin of Madeleines and why they happen to be called that. But if you bake them in scallop shells, you would call it Monster Cookie Saint-Jacques, I think, wouldn't you? But anyway, I think this is a very cute little thing. And now we're going to butter the pans, and you want about 1 tablespoon of flour in these 2 tablespoons of browned butter. And then you just butter the pans. And you want to be sure that you just have a very light coating of butter and flour in the pans, because if you have too heavy a coating, it'll pool up down in the middle and you'll get this effect. You see, that's where there was a little pool of butter. So after you have buttered them, then go over it a little bit with a dry brush to make sure that a pool has not settled down in the middle of the pan. But this browned butter and flour mixture is called beurre de commercy. And commercy, it's spelled like commerce with a Y on it. But that's the town in France that makes the most famous Madeleines. And for a long time, their recipe was a secret. I've dropped my glasses. But then finally, I don't know, somebody let out the secret. And now we're going to have enough batter for 1 big 9 by 2 inch cake, or 2 8-inch cakes, or 4 dozen cupcakes, or a big jelly roll, or 48 Madeleines, or 24 cookies Saint-Jacques. And I'm going to get back to our batter here and see how that's doing. And we have all the rest of the ingredients except the flour. And I'm going to review, just in case you might have gotten lost with all this jabber going on. We have 4 large eggs and 2/3 cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, and the grated rind of run lemon, which are getting beaten to a foamy, beautiful state, 5 or 6 minutes. Then we have 4 ounces of melted butter that's been browned, a beurre noisette. And now we're going to have 2/3 cup of all-purpose cake flour and all-purpose flour and 1/3 cup of cake flour. And we have a sifter, and there's 1/3 cup dry measure dipped into the flour, and there's another 1/3 swept off even with the cup. And then we want 1/3 cup of cake flour, and cake flour is sometimes hard to find. You just look down at the bottom shelf and it says plain bleached cake flour, and there is 1/3 cup of the cake flour. And now, if you want to do this egg business ahead, just keep it running low, but be sure not overbeat. And when it's done, I want you to take a good look at this. This makes the ribbon. See, when you lift it up, there's a ribbon on the surface which slowly dissolves. This is something that we've done before, but you're always running into it in recipes. And from now on, from after this step, you've got to go right on non-stop, so that, as you see, there are certain things you can get ahead, but be sure that you have your oven preheated to 375 degrees, and then right on through to finish the cake. And what we're now going to do into this eggs and sugar is to alternate folding in the flour and the butter. And be sure that the egg-sugar mixture is not cold, because if it's cold when your butter goes in, it's going to coagulate rather than remaining melting. Then I put in about 1/3 of the flour, now just a little tiny stream of the butter. And then you put on some more flour. And you keep right on folding gently all the time. And you notice this fold technique. You go straight down with a spatula and plop down in the middle, to the side, and up and around, and you're folding in your flour. And then you're folding in your butter. And the reason that you're using partly all-purpose and partly cake flour here is because the cake flour alone is so light that when you're adding melted butter, the melted butter can all sink down to the bottom of the batter. And that would give you a soggy bottom. And as we know, soggy bottoms are not to be tolerated. And you see, with this system, when the flour is almost folded in, then you keep adding the butter. And look, you notice you have these little light brown parts. And I'm going to add them right in, because I think they give a nice flavor. That is really what gives the noisette part. There's a little something, well, and it's gone. And this depends on how well you've done your butter. If you burnt it like that, or it's too dark, you wouldn't add it in. But it's these little milk solids that give a lovely taste to the batter, along with the lemon and the vanilla. And actually this batter that we're using, which is used mostly for the Madeleines, but can be used for anything else, is somewhat taken after the batter of Commercy, that famous Madeleine place. And that little butter noisette is really what gives it its particular flavor, and it also gives it a particular lightness and crispness. And I've tried a lot of other formulas like plain butter and so forth, but none of them are quite as good as this. And now into the Madeleine pans. And they're to be filled about 1/2 to 2/3 full. And I think that a spoon with a pointed tip is the easiest way to do it. Madeleines I think, owe their fame to Marcel Proust, the French writer who wrote eloquently of them in Swann's Way. That was the first volume of Remembrance of Things Past. And he described them with such lusciousness that I think that put Madeleines on the map. And when he had the 100th anniversary of his birth, there were so many people making Madeleines in his honor that you couldn't find a Madeleine pan anywhere. I think that was at the time that the Hong Kong people began making Madeleine pans. There they are, and they should go, I think, immediately into the oven. And you can make 4 sets of Madeleine pans with this recipe, and they can all bake together. This is in the upper middle and lower middle levels, and the 4 pans can fit right in there. And they should bake about 10 to 12 minutes. And I'm going to set my timer and get rid of that disgusting black butter. I'm rather glad that happened, though. Now we still have 3/4 of this mixture, and we can make a jelly roll with that. And you want to butter this pan with the same mixture of brown butter and flour. That was 2 tablespoons of brown butter mixed with 1 tablespoon of flour. And besides being a wonderful non-stick business, it also has a good taste. And this just a jelly roll pan with wax paper, and you leave 2 inches over, hanging over. And then your batter goes right in. You want to be sure with this batter, because of the melted butter, that you don't delay at all, because the butter does have a tendency to sink. And I think it's a good idea if you waited a little bit just to give it a very slight fold, being very careful always not to deflate the batter. And then in it goes to the pan, which is about 11 by 17. You can use it on a plain cookie sheet. You don't have to have these edges at all. And then spread it out. And of course, puffs up. And this again, like the Madeleines, goes into a 375 oven. And it can go, I'm going to bake it right along with the Madeleines. And what you can do when you're baking several things at once is you can shift levels about halfway through. But when you open the oven with anything like this that you're baking, be sure to do it very fast, because you don't want the oven to cool off. You notice also I've not banged the pan on the work surface, because that forces little bubbles out. So in this goes, along with the Madeleines. And this too will take 10 to 12 minutes, and you want to be sure and not overcook it, because when you're going to have a jelly roll, if you've overcooked your cake, it doesn't roll very well. It has to be left rather soft. Now, I'll take out Madeleines so you can see how they look when they're done. And that was about 10 to 12 minutes. And they get lightly browned, and you want to, and they shrink just a little bit from the side of the mold, and you just want to unmold them rapidly. See, there you are, and you see how very nicely how nicely that beurre noisette has kept. And you unmold them, and you can serve them just like this, particularly if they have unmolded nicely. Or you can sprinkle a little powdered sugar on, whatever you like. The powdered sugar is mostly to cover up any little messes that you've made in unmolding. And if you're not going to eat them right away, the best way to keep them is to freeze them when they're cool, and that's just in a very few minutes. I want you to see how they are. They're crisp. See that? It's a nice little cookie. It's not a soggy, spongy thing. And you want to keep them crisp, and the best way to do it is to spread them out in layers and cover them with wax paper, and then cover them airtight and freeze them, and they keep very, very well. Now here's the jelly roll when it's done. you take it out of the oven. This one now has powdered sugar on it because I took it out of the oven before. But when it's done, you press it and it's lightly spongy, and it's just begun to show the slightest line of shrinkage around the edge of the pan, but it's still soft, and just be very careful that you don't overdo it. And then, as soon as you get it out, take powdered sugar in a sieve and just sieve on about a 1/16 inch layer. And the sugar evidently keeps it soft. And then put on some wax paper and a dampened towel, and then put a cookie sheet or something on top and turn it upside down and let it cool 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes have gone by, you're ready to unmold it. But you can leave it longer than 10 minutes if you want. And then, after it's cooled, you pull, there's that edge of the paper, and you just lift the pan off. No stick, so it doesn't stick, very easily off. And then there's your paper, and that comes off extremely easily because of that fancy brown butter and flour mixture. There's really an excellent no-stick thing for all kinds of cakes. And then it still has its wax paper. Here I'm going to stick a baking sheet underneath it. But as you can see that that's nice, and I hope that's nice and thin, I'm not sure. But we shall now roll it. And this is ready to be any kind of a rolled cake, like a bûche de Noël or a jelly roll. This is going to be a jelly roll, but a French type jelly roll with a little bit of liqueur on top of it. That makes a lot of difference. Because a plain jelly roll is kiddie food, and if you put a little liqueur, like orange liqueur, kirsch on it, then it becomes human food, finally. And that's about a tablespoon or so. And then we're going to have some jam, just plain, ordinary jam. That's going to be raspberry. That's what I like about French, some of these French recipes, that they're really very simple indeed, and use very simple ingredients, but that little bit of kirsch makes a great deal of difference. Just spread that all over. And I'm going to roll it long way, so I want to be sure to have a little bit that comes out at the ends. I really should have had a little more jam, but I don't. But that's what often happens when you're in your own home. You just have one little pot of jam, but you can make it do. And then, as another little fillip of interest, sprinkled on some shaved almonds. Apricot jam is very nice too, but I don't think it shows up as well. Now, I'm going to roll it up and put it onto something. I'll put it onto this board. And roll it lengthwise. You can see how useful it is to have that paper. And the sugar also makes it non-stick. And then onto the board. That's another reason it's always good to have something like powdered sugar or parsley, because it covers up all kinds of things. Then it's going to have some more paper on, just to keep it a little neater. Move this a little nearer to me. And then something on the top. I think it looks rather dreary if nothing's on top. So I'm going to put on some kumquats, which I bought at my supermarket, which I think are very pretty. If you were And you could put fresh strawberries along the top of it. There, I think that looks very nice. I could have, I'm going to reach over here to get my powdered sugar. I think there's a little piece right on the end that I think could be fixed. So don't ever be discouraged if you make little messes, because you can usually fix them with something. I got some powdered sugar on top of that, so I'll put a little bit more all over and give a snow effect everywhere. So, ready to go. We're having a tea party with all kinds of goodies. And I'm going to serve you a piece of jelly roll. A nice big piece off the end. Put on a piece of kumquat on the side and some whipped cream. That's only a starter, because there's creme saint honoré and chocolate mousse and all kinds of things. And then going to have, this is a tea party, so we'll have to have a little bit of tea too. And, you know, our friend Marcel Proust, who is really our hero this evening, he made the Madeleine, he gave it eternal life because of this book of his. And in it, this is in part of the first chapter and near the end of it. And Proust says that his mother sent out for one of those little cakes, short and plump, court et dodu, called petits Madeleines, which seemed to have been molded in the ribbed cavity of a scallop shell. And at the instant when a mouthful of tea mixed with the crumbs of the Madeleine touched his tongue, he shivered. A delicious pleasure invaded him. And that was the beginning of one of the great classics in French literature. And you know, I think when you take a Madeleine and you take a little sip of tea with it, it really does give you something to remember. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit!
This program was made possible by a grant from Polaroid Corporation. Julia Child is the author of From Julia Child's Kitchen, which includes the recipes from this program.